Hey guys, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it. My name's Gary again. I'm from Cleerline and I actually head up the training and certification for Cleerline fiber optic or Cleerline Technology Group. And the object of today's webinar is, as Gary mentioned, to try and keep it down to 45, 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have some questions and answers and whatnot. But what we're going to do today is we're going to basically go over an overview of fiber and start to discuss, for those of you that are not familiar with it, start to discuss some of the benefits to using fiber as opposed to category cable. We're going to look at the basic overview of fiber and how it's made and what it comprises of. We're going to start to look at some of the variations in fiber because that can be very confusing to those that are not familiar with fiber or they've only seen it a little bit. The different variations can be a bit overwhelming. And to decide when to use which, obviously, is something that's going to be in your hands in the future. So we help you to kind of walk through some questions and identify how to decipher which type of fiber construction you would need for which type of application. So similarly, so for connectors, one of the most frequent questions I get is, okay, well, I want to use fiber. It's going to be multi-mode fiber, but which connector do I use? So we'll discuss that as well. It really is very, very simple. Trust me. I'm going to give you a live demonstration of Cleerline fiber in particular. So for those of you that are a little bit familiar with fiber, I'm sure you are thinking to yourself that it is, difficult. It's fiddly because you're dealing with tiny little pieces of glass, which are very fragile and can break easily. Cleerline has incorporated some technology into their glass fiber, which makes it very, very strong and easy to terminate. So much so that I can guarantee that every one of you on this presentation today, I could teach within 15 minutes how to terminate our glass. Okay, so I'll do a live demonstration for you to see that. And hopefully that removes a lot of the inhibitions that you may have with using fiber. Then we'll go over to some of the more generalized pieces and parts, like some of the overview of the enclosures and accessories that we offer as well to kind of round out the infrastructure of the fiber. And then we'll just have a couple of examples of applications at the end, just to show you some very basic uses of fiber in some examples of where you might use it. And then we'll have some questions and answers at the end. And by all means, please raise your hand. In your toolbar there, raise your hand or raise a question for Gary. He's going to be keeping an eye on that. And if anything comes up that's relevant to the slide we're on, please go ahead and ask the question, and we can by all means address it there and then. So, okay, the benefits to using fiber. Now, I think for the most part, whenever I talk to people about why they would use fiber, these three things come up. Okay, first of all, they think about high data throughput or bandwidth, as people refer to it as. They talk about speed and they talk about distance. All right, so these are the three characteristics of fiber which really kind of stick out as being the benefits to using fiber over twisted pair. All right, and we'll talk more about the different types of fiber in just a few minutes. But to give a couple of examples and facts about fiber, multi-mode, again, we'll talk more about what multi-mode is in just a few slides here. But multi-mode fiber can actually transmit 100 gigabit per second up to approximately 150 meters or 500 feet. All right, so that's 100 times 10 to the power 9 bits per second. All right, so there's a massive amount of data without even flinching an eye. Single mode, on the other hand, again, we'll talk about the differences. Single mode fiber, that's what they would use to connect cities together or different buildings together, and even continents. That's what goes under the oceans. Single mode fiber can, in theory, transmit up to 1.2 petabits. That's 1.2 times 10 to the power 15 bits per second, up to several tens of kilometers. So it's a very, very powerful medium for transferring data. So when we talk about it, those three things, the data throughput, speed, and distance are really the three things that come to mind. However, there's a fourth one, which really is very, very relevant now, specifically to AV. Particularly now we're seeing more and more AV over IP, and that's latency. All right, latency is the time it takes for a data packet to get from its source to its destination. All right. And obviously, what we aim for is zero latency. We want that data packet to be able to get from its source to its destination instantaneously. So there's no lag, there's no latency in the system working. Right, so that's becoming more and more relevant and important in today's infrastructure needs as well. And sure enough, fiber gives us that almost latency-free delivery of those data packets. But there are also some peripheral advantages to using fiber as well, some of which people don't really consider, but are very, very useful. Fiber, unlike copper and other types of media, it's got no metallic parts or electrically conductive components to it. So therefore, it makes it, immune to things like power surges, EMI, radio frequency interference, ground loop interference, and lightning strikes. And it won't corrode, right? So those of you that are actively doing installations in high humidity areas or around the coastline where you've got high salt content in the atmosphere, these are some of the things that you need to consider when you're using twisted pair. It has to be in a managed, environmentally managed area in order for these things not to be an influence on the twisted pair. Well, when you're using fiber, none of these things really matter. It can't conduct electricity and it doesn't corrode because there's no metallic component to it. So think about the number of times you've gone to a project and you've installed Cat6 and maybe even Cat6 shielded, which helps for sure. But you've calibrated all your display screens, the client's happy, you've handed over the project, and all of a sudden the client moves into their home and they have a baby monitor, or they install a microwave, or there's something else going into the building from another trade, inducing electromagnetic interference into the building that wasn't there before. You're going to get that phone call that says, well, that TV looked great, but now there's glitching or there's flickering or there's lines across it. It's because, the twisted pair is picking up some kind of electromagnetic or RFI interference from somewhere. And ground loops are a terrible problem when it comes to HD-based T transmission and things like that. All of those things, they go away with the use of fiber. So think about that for just a second as being sort of an additional benefit to using fiber. A lot of people think that fiber is difficult to terminate and it's expensive and things like that. So I'm going to prove you wrong on that today. For those that have not seen the demonstration, you'll see today that I can easily terminate fiber very quickly in less than a minute or so. It's affordable too. All right. To give an example of cost, the type of fiber we generally see used to connect two IP switches together, two network switches, is a fiber called duplex. It's two strands of fiber together. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But a duplex multimode fiber, 305 meters or 1,000-foot spool of that is roughly the same price of a spool of shielded Cat6A now. All right, so it's not dissimilar in cost to a good quality Cat6A already. Additionally, there's the benefit of it being lightweight, so it's much, much easier to handle. You pick up 1,000 foot of Cat6A and you're picking it up, all right? It weighs 50, 55 pounds, perhaps. Compare that to an equivalent fiber optic cable. Again, that duplex, it kind of depends on how many strands and the type of jacket, but typically 1,000-foot spool of fiber, not only is it much smaller, it's a 3 millimeter diameter versus the 7 to 10 millimeters you might get with, Cat6. It's a much, much lighter medium. A 1,000-foot spool of fiber is only going to be 10, 15 pounds. It's not going to be 50 pounds. All right. So it's much, much easier to take to utilize, and easier. It takes up far less room as an infrastructure product. So why are we talking about fiber specifically for AV? Well, it really boils down to this, and I'm sure this is something that you've seen in one shape or form before. But ultimately, we've been living in a world of HDMI 2.0 for a while now, which operates at 18 gigabit per second in its uncompressed raw format. All right. So before that, we had HDMI 1.4, which happily sat at 10.2 gigabit per second. And for those of you that are unaware, category cable Cat6 can operate quite comfortably up to 10.2 gigabit per second, no problem at all. When you go above that, it starts to struggle. Now you can get more than 10 gig through a twisted pair, but you have to do goofy things with it, and it becomes fairly expensive from an electronics perspective. All right, so whenever we're dealing with something of HDMI 2.0 spec or 18 gigabit per second over a twisted pair infrastructure, there's going to be some compression. No ifs, ands, why, buts, or wherefores. There's going to be some type of compression. And what that means is you're compromising to some degree or another the potential performance of the system and the delivery, the quality of the video being delivered the other end. Now, don't get me wrong. There are some fantastic products out there which utilize some really, really good compression algorithms. I'm sure a lot of you have got, you know, your own vendors that you work with, whether it's through Snap or otherwise, that are giving you access to products that you put an HDMI 2.0 18 gig source into it, and out the other end comes a crystal clear, perfect looking picture. All right. Some are better than others. Some of them are downright terrible. But the fact of the matter is, it's not passing 18 gig, it's passing 10.2 gig. It's actually compressing it at one end, sending it through the twisted pair and decompressing it the other end, a bit like zipping up a computer file and emailing it, okay, and then unzipping it the other end. It's having to make some assumptions, it's taking some of the information away and then putting it back in the way it believes it should be the other end, okay? So with that being said, HDMI 2.0 at 18 gig over twisted pair is actually not too bad, because we can do it with some really cool compression algorithms. But what's now the spec? What now is the new spec is HDMI 2.1. And when HDMI 2.1 is fully deployed, we're going to whack that bandwidth up to 48 gigabit per second. All right. So as we transition into the new displays with the HDMI 2.1 ports on them, and as we transition over to the new PS5 or the Xbox X series, we're going to see more and more of this high bandwidth 48 gigabit per second content that needs to be delivered to a display screen that can show that. All right. And that's going to be nigh on impossible over any kind of distance without the ability of using fiber. Okay. It's just not going to be possible. So when we start talking about HDMI 2.1 with all the cool functions like enhanced HD, eARC, frame by frame dynamic range, deeper color bit depths, great, you know, the Rec 2020 color spectrum, which is more what we as human beings see with our own eyes, much more realistic color spectrum than we've had before. Once we start talking about these things and trying to transmit them over more than just a few feet or meters, you know, it becomes really, really difficult. Okay, so realistically, if you want to deliver today's true 4K with HDR and all the other fun stuff that comes with HDMI 2.1, fiber's going to be your only solution going forward. Any questions on that, guys? Gary, any questions at this point?
Yeah, you know what? A good one we could bring up due to latency. If we'd like to pause 1 second and talk about it. Balarama asks, in regards to data latency, fiber has to convert twice, copper to fiber, fiber to copper, to connect that source and destination of a signal, that is Apple TV in the AV rack in the basement, up to the TV, up to the master bedroom. How does this affect latency? How much does using fiber improve this latency over going copper only?
I'm not familiar with the exact specifics, but I have seen an apples to apples comparison, and it is infinitely quicker. I mean, it's almost incomparable. I mean, you can't see it. And the reason it becomes as important as well is, and I'll talk about this in just a second, but you know, as data bits or data packets pass over an infrastructure, whether it's copper or fiber, you know, they're all traveling at basically, you know, the same speed, but some of them they kind of bang into each other and they bounce off the sides, and they can slow down, and it can cause problems. That is significantly reduced with fiber. I don't know exactly by how much, but when I've seen fiber infrastructure demonstrated next to twisted pair, there is a couple milliseconds that you can see with a twisted pair switchover versus it not being visible to the human eye by way of fiber. I don't know the exact numbers to be honest with you, but it is significantly quicker.
Thanks for the question there. We're clear. Let's keep going.
All right, so kind of to elaborate a bit further on what we just looked at on the previous slide, this is an interesting chart, and in actual fact, it's out of date. I need to have this updated by my colleagues here. So what we're looking at here is kind of the history of HDMI starting with 1.4 and all of the different frame rates, compression aspects, and color bit depths, and whether there was HDR or not, things like that. And as you'll see, you know, there's kind of a storyboard. You can't just say 4K, or you can't just say 1080p, all right? 1080p could be anywhere from 2.23 gigabit per second all the way up to 4 or 5 gigabit per second, right? Depending on the bit depth, whether it's got HDR or not, or whether the compression ratios are, you know, this, that, or the other. The color compressions are one versus the other, 444 versus 420. All right, and as we step up to 4K and HDMI 2.0 with higher frame rates and obviously deeper color bit depth, and we start to introduce HDR, you'll see that we rapidly approach that 10.2 gigabit per second, what we call the line of innovation. We've fondly termed it that. And that's where copper begins to kind of struggle, and you have to introduce compression to some degree, versus fiber being able to take you above that 10.2 gig without any compression being necessary. So as we start talking about HDMI 2.0 at 4K 60 frames per second, full color 444, with wider color gamut and HDR, we're heading up to that 18 gigabit per second bandwidth, which we know HDMI 2.0 requires at full capacity. So like I said, this chart needs to be updated because I don't have HDMI 2.1 on there, right? As we start introducing HDMI 2.1, we step up to 24 gig and then up to 48 gig as the full spectrum or the full specification of HDMI 2.1 becomes deployed and available. We're going to start ramping up to the 48 gigabit per second. And it's already happening. All right, the content is already being recorded and has been recorded in actual fact in 8K for many years now. It's just not been able to be delivered cost effectively, and the display screens haven't been able to reproduce that 8K and the bright colors and things until now. All right, but now display screens and the technology within them have become affordable, and they can reproduce all of that cool content. Now we need to be able to deliver it. All right, obviously it's been there. It's been available. We've not needed to deliver it because the display screens can't reproduce it. Now that's changed. Okay, so that kind of gives the full story behind the history of HDMI and where we've gone from a couple gigabits per second all the way up to 18 gig per second. All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of fiber itself. Some of you may be familiar, some of you may not. So my apologies if this is repetitive to some of you, but it's never a bad thing to actually hear something twice like this. Single mode versus fiber, multi-mode. These are really the two types of fiber you're gonna run into. Okay, single mode fiber is not to be mistaken by single strand fiber. This is one of the most confusing topics when introducing somebody to fiber for the first time. All right. Fiber can either be single mode or multi-mode, not to be confused with single strand versus multi-strand. All right. Single mode fiber consists of a single light wave or mode being transmitted versus multi-mode fiber having several light waves or modes transmitted at a given time. Okay, so you can see the difference there between the top diagram versus the bottom diagram, the different modes or beams of light being transmitted through what we call the core of the fiber. Okay, so the fiber sizes are expressed by using two numbers. Single mode fiber is, as you can see to the left, 9/125. And what that means is the inner core, the white part of the channel there, the small round dot, the white dot there, that's the inner core, all right? That's the tube down which, or the glass tunnel, if you will, that's the part where the light transmits. Around that, the blue part here is a cladding, okay? Again, it's glass. So you've got glass in the middle and glass around the outside. The glass around the outside has a different refractive property to the glass on the inside, all right? It's a bit like comparing when you have, a straw and you put the straw into a glass of water and it looks like the straw is bent, all right? That's because the refractive property of water is different to the refractive property of air, all right? Similar concept here. The difference in refractive properties between core and cladding mean that the light bounces down the core, it doesn't bounce out into space, okay? So single mode, one beam of light down a 9 micron core with 125 micron buffer jacket, cladding around it. To give you an idea, a human hair is around about 80 microns. So we're looking at something that is pretty much the same size as a human hair at this point. And the core itself, significantly smaller. All right, that's part of the problem with fiber, it's very, very small. Multi-mode fiber has a significantly bigger core size. Now, you can't tell the difference with the naked eye, it's just frankly too small. But we're looking at something that's, you know, almost 6 times the size. All right, at 50 microns. So you've got a 50 micron core with 125 micron cladding. Again, that cladding stops those beams of light bouncing out to space. But this time you've got multiple modes or multiple beams transmitting down the fiber at the same time. Now, if you look at the diagram, you'll see the blue beam down the middle is pretty direct. All right, so it's traveling very quickly down the middle. Then you've got the black one, which is being transmitted at the same time, but it's traveling a slightly longer distance because it's going up and down like an AC waveform. And then you've got the red one, which is traveling even further of a distance because it's traveling around the outside of the core. All right, so even though they're being transmitted at the same time and they're going at the same speed, they're actually traveling slightly different distances. And what that means is that it leads to a phenomenon called modal dispersion. Okay, so over distance, multi-mode fiber becomes kind of compromised a little bit because those modes of light end up being, you know, being received at different times. So multi-mode fiber is generally used for distances up to about 1,000, 1,200 feet. All right, there's no set definitive specification on that. A lot depends on the hardware you're plugging into. But the takeaway from this slide is that you've got 2 types of fiber. You've got single mode, you've got multi-mode. Single mode is long distance, high bandwidth. That's what they use under the oceans, between cities, between buildings. Anything around about 1,000 foot or beneath, you know, underneath that, you're looking at multi-mode. The simple reason being that A, it becomes a little bit compromised after that distance, but B, the endpoints on the multi-mode fiber are a lot cheaper than the single mode. So single mode fiber, the endpoints that you plug in are actually very expensive compared to multi-mode fiber endpoints. Okay, so whenever you want to try and do a fiber infrastructure within a building, it pays for itself to use multi-mode within the building. You can use single mode. All right, there's nothing stopping you from using single mode fiber on those short distances, but the hardware that you're going to plug into the end is going to cost you more money. Okay, so if you're under 1,000, 1,200 feet, you can go with multi-mode and the endpoints are less expensive. Okay, so the basic construction or the elements that go into fiber are these. As I mentioned just now, you've got that very inner core. That's that 50 or 9 micron glass core in the middle. 9 being for single mode, 50 being for multi-mode. And then you've got the cladding, which I mentioned just now, that 125 micron cladding. Okay, that's kind of that mirror that keeps the light within the core. And then above that, you've actually got 2 coatings. You've got a primary and a secondary coating called an acrylate and a buffer jacket. And this is where you start to have to strip back these layers when you're preparing fiber for termination. And again, this is what you hear of, you know, when you start talking about learning how to use fiber, you have to go to school and you have to learn how to strip this back specifically, and then you have to clean the glass underneath, similar to when you clean, you know, a tungsten halogen lamp or the headlamp on your car. If you touch it, you get grease and such from your fingers on the lamp, and it can compromise the performance or the life expectancy of the bulb. Similarly with fiber optic, because it's a pure glass, you need to clean any impurities off it before you go ahead and you terminate that glass underneath. Okay, you'll see why that's not the case with Cleerline in a second, but I wanted to explain to you what you're looking at in a basic traditional fiber first off. So you've got the core, the cladding, and then you've got these 2 layers, an acrylate layer and a buffer jacket. And then above that, you've got some Kevlar strengthening members. Those are basically yellow straw-like or hair-like fibers, generally made of Kevlar, which is the same substance they use for bulletproof vests. That's there for you primarily for the installation. Okay, you would actually pull on those Kevlar strength members during installation. You wouldn't want to pull on the glass itself or on the jacket because you can compromise the fiber. That Kevlar there doesn't stretch. It's got a very, very high tensile tolerance. You pull on that to install your fiber. And then there's various jackets above that. In this case, you've just got the single orange jacket. You may have several more above that. You might have armored plating for direct burial. You might have different types for use underwater or under the ground or in a commercial space. So fundamentally, though, you're always going to have these 4 or 5 layers and then the build out of the fiber above that. And each of these layers, the jacket and the acrylate and the buffer jacket, they need to be stripped back to a very specific length and prepared, ready for termination. All right. So that again is where some of the inhibition comes from with regard using fiber. Now, Cleerline goes about this a little differently, and we introduced a proprietary polymer to the fiber, which makes it very, very, very simple to use, makes it safe to use, and it makes the glass underneath it incredibly strong. Okay. So the first thing you can notice on this diagram is that we don't need the 900 micron buffer jacket. All right. The reason being, if you look from the core outwards, you've still got the core. All right. That's obviously where the light bounces down, and it's still a 9 or 50 micron core. That's very important. That's a standard. That's an industry standard. Above that, we've got that cladding, right? That mirror layer. But we actually reduce the size of that very slightly, and we'll build it back up to industry standard size of the 125 micron using our proprietary SSF polymer, stronger, safer, faster, right? It's stronger to handle, safer to handle, and faster to terminate. That's where the SSF comes from. And that polymer stays on the cladding. You don't remove that, all right? And that makes our glass incredibly strong and durable and safe to handle, all right? But remember, we're still at that 125 micron layer, which means we are not a proprietary system. We can use our fiber with anybody's connectors. You can use our connectors with anybody's fiber. It's not a proprietary system like some of them are out there, okay? Because we still conform to that 125 micron cladding. Above that, you've got a 250 micron soft acrylate, right? Remember I said before, you have to strip the various layers of a traditional fiber back to very specific lengths using strippers. With ours, I'm going to demonstrate in just a moment here, you actually strip that off with bare fingers. You don't need to use any strippers to be able to prepare our fiber for a termination, all right? But because you leave the polymer underneath it, that still protects the cladding and the core. You don't have to use alcohol wipes. You don't have to clean it the same way I mentioned with the tungsten halogen lamps earlier. You don't have to do any of that. So our preparation and termination becomes significantly easier and quicker as a result of that polymer, all right? So now I'm going to turn my camera on, if I can. And Gary, if you can pin me so you can make me big on the screen. So now I'm going to do this. It becomes interesting on the display screen here, but I'm hoping you can all see this.
I just pinned, but it's not large. I did the same thing as before.
Okay, maybe I have to click on this.
But yeah, I want everybody to see those crafty hands.
So I'm not big right now. I'm just small.
Right.
Okay, so maybe
pinned.
I don't understand why. Maybe I have to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Pause share. How's that?
Still the same.
Okay. Stop share.
There we go.
Okay. So I'm going to have to turn it back on. So I'm now big, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So what we have here, and I'm trying to look at this with my camera angled down and be able to see the display at the same time so I can see what you're looking at. This is what we call a duplex. This is the fiber I was referring to earlier as being the type of fiber that you would typically see used between network switches, what they call SFP, small format pluggable devices that would plug into the end of a network switch in one of those goofy looking ports that kind of look like an RJ45 port, but they're not. So this is typically used for transmit and receive. This is by far and away, our highest selling product, multi-mode duplex fiber. And it's kind of like two fibers together. It's just like in a shotgun type arrangement where you can separate that, as you can see. So at this point, I've already got on the end, here's one I made earlier. I've already got a termination on the one end, and I've got a light source here. And so if I bring the other end to the camera, you can see I've got light coming out of the end, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take what we call an SC connector, and we discuss connectors in a bit more detail in just a couple of slides here. I'm going to unscrew the back of the boot here, and I'm going to place that onto the end of the fiber. That's the first thing I want to do. I'm going to put that to the side for a second. Now, we sell these termination kits in these black cases, and it comes with all the tools you need for Cleerline. It's got a pair of cutters, strippers. It's got a cleave tool, which I'll show you about in a minute. It's got a little garbage pot for my disposables here. I'll show you that in a sec. And then it's got the VFL, the flashlight thing, which I had in the end there. So I'm going to take my strippers. And you remember with the traditional fiber, I told you that we have to strip down those various layers. And that's what these are for. Again, there's nothing proprietary about our fiber. So you can use conventional tooling. All right, so you can see here there are 3 different holes on these strippers, and that's for use with traditional conventional fiber, where you've got to strip away each of those different layers. With ours, we only need the biggest of the 3. All right, we nip away the jacket at about 4 inches or so. Just nip it, put the strippers away. We don't need those anymore. Just pull the jacket off like so. And you can see here, these are those yellow Kevlar aramid yarns that I was mentioning. So if you kind of flick the fiber away, you can see my strand of fiber here is kind of bounced out of there. This is what I would use to install the fiber. I'd probably take a little bit more on that back and make a loop out of it. And I would use this to pull the fiber through conduit or through stud bays rather than pull on the jacket itself or the fiber. Okay, so that's what that's for. But these also come into use in the back of the connector to provide strain relief as well. So we're going to kind of wrap these back together again, and we'll keep those out of the way for a second. Now, what we're looking at here is that blue acrylate, that soft peel acrylate, which I was mentioning earlier. Okay, so this is, you remember I mentioned that, with a conventional fiber, you'd have to use one of these 3 holes and strip that back to a very precise length. Don't need to do that with ours. All right, you saw just now, it was kind of a random length of about 4 inches. I took that jacket off. Now I'm just going to take back that soft peel, that blue part. You can see it's coming off between my finger and thumb here. I hope you can see that on the camera. And in fact, if I grab a piece of paper here, you can probably see it better. There we go. There's the blue acrylate, the soft acrylate coming off between my finger and thumb. All right. So you can see I've removed that. Now, what you would normally be down to with conventional fiber is that glass cladding, and I would have to take alcohol swabs and clean that to make sure there are no impurities on there, okay? But what you're looking at here is actually that proprietary polymer which we introduced to our cladding. So I don't need to worry about that. All I need to do is remove that soft acrylate, and I don't need to worry about cleaning it because my polymer protects my glass underneath it, okay? Now what I need to do, having done those 2 things, strip back the jacket and remove that acrylate, I need to cut the fiber to the correct length, okay? Now, normally with traditional fiber, there are multiple different measurements to make. With ours, we only care about 1 measurement, and that's the measurement from the end of the jacket here to where we're going to cut this specifically for the connector I'm using, all right? Now, in this case, I'm using an SC connector. Again, we'll talk about connectors in just a second. So I'm gonna cut this to the length, and these connectors come in packs of 10. They come with the instructions, and in the instructions, it tells you how long you need to cleave it. Okay. In this particular case, it's 24 millimeters. So we take our cleave tool from our kit, and we're going to lay the fiber down, and you can see there's a ruler here. So I'm going to measure at 24 millimeters and lay the fiber down at 28 millimeters for an SC connector. I'm going to lay that down at the correct length and then close the trap door here, okay, like so. And you can see my fiber is actually laying down flat across these 2 plates here, all right? And that's at the correct length, being from 28 millimeters from the end of the jacket to this little wheel that goes across and cuts it. All right, so now I'm going to close the trap door. Okay, I'm going to cleave it. So now I've gone ahead and I've scored and I've cut the fiber. You'll see now the piece that was cut off is here. With regular fiber, I'd be super cautious where that goes. I don't want to lose that in clothing or in carpet or in, or something like that, because it can poke you. With ours, You can see I can literally poke my skin with it and it won't penetrate. All right, it's very, very safe. I am going to put it in the little disposal pot though, just to make sure I'm being sensible here. So now I've cut the fiber to the correct length. I'm going to insert the fiber into the connector. And you'll see as I do so, the light will travel along this little channel here. And as I get to the end, the light will come out of the tip and the window will extinguish. It will go dark. And in doing so, I'm actually going to push my fiber all the way in, and then I'm going to apply some force to it. That gives this connector the ability to have a very low loss signal in there, a very low attenuation termination. Normally, if you take regular fiber and you do that, you have to be very, very careful not to apply too much pressure, otherwise it can snap off. With ours, I actually want to apply pressure to get that zero or close to zero loss as possible on that termination there, all right? So I'm going to insert the fiber. You'll see the light travel along the window there. The window goes pretty dark. It goes almost extinguished and the light comes out of the end. Now there's an activation switch here. I'm going to slide the switch from the back to the front. Now my switch is activated and you can see that's kind of locked the fiber in place. My fiber is now just kind of suspended there. All right, so now that's an active termination. I'm already done. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to dress out the back of the connector. I'm going to lay the fiber down, make sure it doesn't get trapped in the crocodile clip here. So I'm going to lay the fiber down, close the crocodile clip, and this is where the Kevlar comes into play again. So I'm going to bring the boot up with the Kevlar off to the side here. I'm going to capture that Kevlar into the thread of the boot here just by a couple of turns, like so. That gives me strain relief. Remember that Kevlar doesn't stretch, so I can't pull that out now, all right? So now I'm just going to trim that Kevlar off to the correct length. I don't want that hanging out. Finish screwing down that boot on that connector. So it's a nice, neat terminal. There's strain relief at the back, and I'm going to put my cover on. And you can see now that my termination is done, all right? If I'm not talking you through it, I can quite literally do that termination in 45 seconds or so. It's really not difficult. But another key benefit to Cleerline is its ability to be kinked or you know, knotted and such without breaking it. We've got a bend radius tolerance at the glass layer, at the acrylate, that soft peel layer. We can bend that down to 2.2 millimeters, all right, without breaking it. So with this 3 millimeter jacket on here, we can actually bend that and tighten that knot pretty much as hard as I want. I'm putting some force on there, tighten a knot, and you can see it's still not broken. All right, so the benefit to you guys is you can pretty much have anybody on the tools doing this. You don't have to have a highly trained technician do this. You can do it yourself. It's quick, it's safe, it's easy, and it's strong. Now, obviously, I wouldn't leave it like this. If I were to kink my fiber during installation, I would undo that because I am inducing some attenuation here. I wouldn't want to keep it like that. But as soon as I release that kink and I correct my error, my fiber, if I were to run a test on this, it would literally bounce back to its original performance and I would see no damage. Okay? Gary, any questions on that?
We're clear, but that's such an awesome presentation, man. We feel like the completion factor when we actually see it. I don't know, you know, do you think, I'll throw you a suggestion. Can you do a termination, a quick one with no talking?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, would that help? Like,
yeah.
Okay, here it is. Give it to us right there. Same presentation.
I'll do it without talking. But, oh, the other thing to realize is that these connectors, by the way, you can reuse them. All right, so you're going to notice that I just took the cap off. I'm going to leave the dust cap on here. There's a dust cap on the end. You want to keep that on the end to protect the tip. You don't want to get that compromised. If, by the way, you get any dust or molecules on the end of there, we provide cleaning kits to be able to keep that clean. All right, and we'll talk more about that in just a couple slides. So I'm just going to undo the back of the boot here, deactivate that switch and pull the fiber out. And I'm going to leave the boot on there. No, I won't. Let's add that too. So here we go. So here we are with my fiber straight off the spool. All right, I don't know if anyone wants to time me. We'll see how we go. So boot goes on. Strippers come out. I take my strippers and I get rid of the outside jacket. Flick away the Kevlar. peel off that soft acrylate. Like I mentioned, there's no real measurement to it. Just peel off that soft acrylate. Cleave that to the correct length of 28 millimeters for this particular connector. Take the connector, insert the fiber into it until the window goes dark. Close the clip. Now I'm going to bring my boot up, capture the Kevlar into the thread, trim my thread off. Sorry, trim my Kevlar off, tighten my boot, and that's that. I don't know if anybody timed it, but I'm normally around about 40-45 seconds.
Yeah. About that. I think you could have changed an F1 tire in that amount of time. Awesome job there.
So yeah, it's real simple, guys. I do want to show you one other one. There is what's called an LC connector. We have those available too. For those that are not familiar, we'll talk about them in just a second, but the LC connectors are done very similarly. This is what you're going to find more regularly on the back of network switches and things like that. Now, with this one, we go through the exact same process, but this time we only need to cleave it at 24 millimeters, not 28. Again, it comes with instructions in the packet, so you don't need to worry about remembering those numbers, but the process is the exact same. The only difference really is that the LC connectors being smaller, they tend to be a bit tighter when you put the boot back on. So I'm going to insert this again, same way I did previously. I cleaved it at the 24 millimeters. I'm going to take that, put it into the connector. The window will go dark. Of course, that's an old connector I'm using. That's inevitable. Once these connectors are used more than 5 or 6 times, they can become compromised. There we go. So that went dark. You'll see that there. I'm going to slide that activation switch forward. Now, again, I'm going to lay that down in the back. And this is where it comes a bit more tricky because, you know, it just becomes a bit tighter. I'm going to tighten that down, trim off my Kevlar, like so. There's my LC connector done. The LC connectors don't have that same shroud over them that the SC connectors do, but they've got this latch on the back, so you can only place them into the port one way around. So SC connectors the exact same way as the LC connectors, just a slightly different cleave length on the fiber itself. Okay, now I got to share my screen again, right?
Right. We see you nice and large, but no, what an amazing demonstration. And I had 3 or 4 guys, virtual hand claps, you know, amazing were some of the comments. That's the way to go. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Good.
9:45. Gary, what else do you want to go through? And let's have some more questions, but we're getting about 15 minutes till
yep. I want to skip through a couple of things here. Are you looking at my big screen again?
Yes.
Okay, good. So real quick, when you're looking at a job site and using fiber, you got to ask yourself a couple of questions. All right. If you're not familiar, is there already fiber on the project? All right. If there is, you need to determine whether it's single mode or multi-mode. Single mode fiber is not directly compatible with multi-mode fiber. It's a bit like trying to connect a 4-inch pipe with a 1-inch pipe and making them work without leaking, right? So you need to decide whether you've got single mode or multi-mode on the project. And you may also see this too. In the center of the screen there, you can see this 62.5. 62.5 is the older type OM1 or multi-mode fiber. And that 62.5 is what's now the 50. All right, so 62.5 was originally the core size for multi-mode fiber. And obviously that's bigger than 50 microns. So if you've got 62.5 because you installed fiber or somebody installed fiber 10, 15, 20 years ago, they had the foresight to do that. Obviously we need to know that because we have to convert it to the modern day multi-mode equivalent, okay? And that's fine, we can do that. We just need to know about that. But so if you're gonna put fiber in, if there's existing fiber, what is it? If there's no fiber already, really the only questions you need to ask yourself is, okay, how long of a distance do I need to transmit the data? Again, going back to that single mode versus multi-mode question, single mode, anything over about 1,000, 1,200 feet is probably going to be single mode. Multi-mode used underneath that distance, okay? The other question you want to find out is, okay, is there any existing hardware on the project? Have you already got a switch or some kind of fiber optic based hardware that you need to be compatible with? All right, again, you would need to read the specs on that hardware to make sure you're using the right fiber with the hardware, okay? The other way you can determine whether or not you've got single mode or multi-mode is by color of the jacket. Single mode fiber is most certainly going to be yellow. Multi-mode fiber, there's different iterations of types of multi-mode. The OM1 or the older style is going to be a gray color or perhaps orange. That's that 62.5 micron core. And then we go into the sort of the OM3, OM4, OM5. Generally speaking, you're going to be looking at the aqua type colored OM3. That's what we in the industry use the majority of. If you're in the medical field or in some of these more critical environments, sometimes OM4 and you're beginning to see OM5 now being introduced. They're all indicated by differentiated by different jacket colors, okay? So again, that can help you. If you're walking into a job where there's already fiber, that can help you identify what you're working with. The other thing too is the color of the connectors corresponds with the type of fiber you're using, all right? I had a guy once trying to put a single mode connector onto a multi-mode cable. The only way I could determine that was because the colors didn't match, all right? And he thanked me for being able to save him the time of terminating something that wouldn't work. Different constructions, and I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly. We're running out of time here. Honestly, the type of construction you use is really contingent upon the type of application you have in hand, all right? I told you before that our most commonly sold fiber is the duplex for transmit and receive between two data switches. I would never recommend you pull a simplex, which is just one strand, honestly, because you can't fix stupid. If you put a simplex in the wall and somebody comes and hangs a picture and they happen to put that nail through the stud bay and they puncture that fiber, you're out of luck, right? At least with duplex, you've got one extra spare if it only needs one strand. But I would always encourage you to use at least a duplex, if not a multi-strand, which is the micro distribution. This is where we can actually get up to 24 strands of fiber into a single 3 mil jacket, all right? So if you're going rack to rack, or if you're going, you know, perhaps one end of the house to the other end of the house, you're going to use a multi-strand fiber like this because you're going to be interconnecting several different things on different strands of fiber, okay? A breakout cable, frankly, is not dissimilar to a micro distribution. It's just got those extra 2 millimeter jackets around each fiber, all right? So if you're dealing with an environment that is potentially more susceptible to being hit or banged or knocked or something, you might just want that extra layer of protection, which is the breakout, what we call subunits underneath the main jacket. Rugged, micro, corrugated, and aluminum. These are our kind of these good, better, best type, armored type products. The rugged micro is an ideal product for, running in conduit outside. All right, it's water resistant, it's UV resistant, it's got rodent repellents in the jacketing. We again can have several strands in the same jacket here. Okay, so if you're running down to a gatehouse or a pool house or something like that, and you're running it in conduit, you should use a rugged micro in particular because it's UV resistant. So if there is any exposure to light, it won't degrade the jacket over time. But B, it's got rodent resistant compounds in it, so it won't get nibbled by little critters getting into the conduit. If you don't have a conduit, go to the corrugated armored steel. Okay, that's got the armor plate around it so that it's got that physical barrier. All right, so if you don't have conduit, you can directly bury the corrugated ACS armored steel into the ground. Aluminum interlocking, that's more for a commercial space. If you've got a warehouse or a parking lot, something like that, it's basically a pre-threaded aluminum interlocking armored conduit with the fiber inside it. Tactical fiber is a bit like a microphone cable to touch and feel. It's more of a rubberized jacket. It has no memory to it. So if I'm talking to anybody today that is in the rental and staging industry or the pro AV sector, you're going to be using fiber in a temporary application where you don't want that cable gaining any memory to it. You want to be able to spool it and unspool it and have it do its thing. That's where the tactical jacket comes in. It's got no memory. Fiber and power. Anybody out there doing more and more in the way of PoE or security cameras, things like that, obviously the fiber itself cannot carry power. So now we have like it's kind of like a duplex fiber, but it's got two 18 gauge twisted or two 18 gauge copper strands down the one, and we've got two strands of fiber down the other. All right, ideal for a security gate or a media converter that's down at the pool house, something like that. And then we do these bundled fibers as well. So we can do a bundle of, you know, two Cat6s and two single modes or two multi modes, or we can do, you know, whatever type of bundle you require. We can actually make that within reason, depending on the application. So the type of construction you're going to use is really contingent upon the application you're installing it. The only final component to this is, okay, what type of connector do I use? Well, that question is easily answered by the statement below. You don't get to decide what type of connector you use. The hardware you're plugging into it decides that for you. The only thing you need to know is whether you're using single mode or multi-mode. Because like I mentioned, the single mode connector is not compatible with a multi-mode because of those core size differences, 50 versus 9, all right? So you've basically got these two types of connectors which are used in our industry, all right? There are other connectors out there you may run into, but 90% of the time you're going to use one of these two connectors, and probably the LC connector at that. The LC connector is the one I did second just now. It's used for the back of network switches. A single mode version is going to be blue in color, and a multi-mode is going to be aqua. Okay, same with SC. Again, the hardware determines whether it's one or the other. All you've got to determine is what type of fiber you're using, single mode versus multi-mode. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to touch on this too much, but there are things also to consider when we're specifying our projects about link losses and things like that. What I would encourage you to do, guys, is keep an eye out for our notification on our certification classes. I go into this in more detail in those certification classes where we spend a couple of hours going over stuff, and we get into more of this stuff in depth. This is a typical application of where we would see a duplex fiber product used in networking. All right, so we've got the network switch off to the left. We want to extend that off to a media converter or a port, let's say, you know, the other end of the house, or up into an access point, or down into, you know, security gate. You can do that now, you know, reliably and easily with the use of fiber and these what they call small format pluggable devices that convert the electrons into photons and back and forth. Okay. A typical example of fiber being used for video extension. I'm sure you've all had a similar experience here where you needed to get video beyond the capability of that 100-meter Cat5 or Cat6 balun that you've been using. You might need to be able to get it a little further than that. You can do that with fiber optics. Some of them now can go several kilometers over fiber without any problem at all. Just to wrap up here real quick, Cleerline is an end-to-end solution provider. We don't only stop at just the fiber and the tooling and the connectors. We've got a full suite of products which are available to you to round out your entire installation, ranging from termination kits to cleaning. Like I mentioned, it's very important to keep those tips clean. But obviously when you're on site, there's dirt, there's moisture, there's grit, there's grime. Sometimes they can be compromised. The cleaning kits are imperative to have on you to make sure those tips are kept clean and you're doing the job right. Inspection, if you're doing a lot of them, you might want to inspect the ends. We've now got the ability to inspect those ends and test them. Whenever you're testing, you should be cleaning. Whenever you're trying to get an accurate test result, you need to be cleaning those ends. Now, one thing I do want to show you is our active optical cables. These are cool. So active optical cables are HDMI cables, which obviously have, and are you looking at my camera again, Gary, here?
Yes, it's small, but yes, we could see it.
Well, I'm going to do quick. So an active optical cable is an HDMI cable which utilizes obviously 18 strands within the cable here, but 4 of them, the TMDS lines, basically use fiber optic instead of copper. All right. So we've got HDMI cables now, active optical cables that utilize our fiber in these cables. And that means you can bend them, you can pull them, you can mess with them. But more importantly, down the road, when this 18 gig or 48 gig HDMI cable becomes obsolete because we've now gone to 16K or 32K and we're dealing with 178 gigabit per second requirement, you can cut the end off the HDMI cable And you can terminate those fiber strands in there with regular LC or SC connectors and plug them into the next generation of fiber extender. So whether it's AV Pro or Ineos or Atlona, whomever's got the next generation of fiber extender, HDMI over fiber extender, you can now utilize the fiber within the AOC to transmit that data, and you don't have to pull new cable. In other words, when you're pulling a Cleerline active optical cable, you're pulling 4 strands of fiber that you can use in the future. All right, very, very powerful and very, very future proof, if you will, although I don't like that term. All right, last slide I'm going to do. Rounding out the accessories and stuff, we've got different types of connectivity, we've got different installation tools, we've got racks and enclosures depending on what you want to do at the rack end, or we can do wall mounted enclosures. We've got internally rated and externally rated wall enclosures as well. And we've also got an array of different patch cables as well. So if you don't want to be doing the termination on site, we've got the ability for you to buy pre-made patch cables using our glass, so you can still pull on them, you can still tie them in knots, things like that. It doesn't matter. We've got all of the accessories you need to be able to round out the entire installation from A to Z of your fiber infrastructure. All right, I was a bit rushed at the end there. We've got a couple minutes for any questions.
I know Mike was saying, hey, that was fast. Yeah, that was such an awesome presentation. I cannot thank you enough, Gary. The session was awesome. I'm sure everybody would agree with me. All right, a couple questions. Going back a few minutes where Todd was asking about connecting 2 network switches together. Does he need single mode, multi-mode, simplex, or duplex? There was a couple slides on that, so I don't know if Todd got his question answered.
So it's going to depend. First of all, Todd, you want to ask yourself, what is the distance? All right. The distance is going to determine the type of SFP and fiber you use between them. The SFP is that module that slots into the port at the end of the switch that looks like an RJ45, but it isn't. And you're going to buy, or you're going to specify that you need a multi-mode SFP or a single mode SFP, depending on the distance you need to go. All right. If it's beyond 1,000 feet, you're probably looking at a single mode SFP with single mode fiber. And it's likely you can get them where they can transmit and receive over 1 strand of fiber. So there's only 1 fiber going into it, but they're a little bit more expensive because they're a bit more complex. You probably want to get one where you've got 2. So you have a transmit and receive at the back of that SFP. All right. And then you would use the duplex fiber, the same as I just showed you here.
You know, George asks an interesting question. You know, transmitters and receivers are still very expensive. When will prices come down to make fiber practical? Can you elaborate more on as fiber being practical in that sense? Do you see that as a hurdle?
Well, here's what I want to start by saying there. I mean, there's a manufacturer out there called Ineos, and Ineos make a point-to-point HDMI extender over fiber. And 2 years ago, I think they were like $1,800 dealer cost for the pair. They are closer to about $500 now, I think, off the top of my head. In less than 2 years, they are a third, if not a quarter, of the price that they were 2 years ago. And I think that is the same as to be said for the likes of Crestron and others who have fiber-based solutions as well. I mean, I work fairly closely with AV Pro, as you do, Gary, and I've seen their fiber-based solutions come way down. They've got more of them coming out. It's all about supply and demand, right? I mean, as we transition into an industry which is more dependent upon high bandwidth devices like fiber, they're going to come down in price, and they're coming down in price very, very quickly, and they're becoming more readily available. 5 years ago, you walk the floor at CEDIA, you wouldn't find a fiber gear. You'd find Cleerline, but then people would say, okay, that's awesome, but what do I plug into it? But now that's not the case. You walk the floor at CEDIA now, when we can, you're going to find fiber-based products all over the place. So that's going to come down in price a lot quicker now.
And Volutone carries Ineos as well. Joel asks, does rugged micro come in a duplex?
Yes, not in a duplex. No, a duplex in its true sense means that you've got 2 like that together, okay? What you might be meaning is, does it come in 2 strand? Yes, it does. In other words, it's got 1 jacket with 2 strands of fiber down it. Yes, it does.
Mike has a question. If we use your active optical cables and an end is damaged, can we field repair or replace it?
No.
Okay.
No. There are field terminatable HDMI heads out there. They're incredibly unreliable, I found. They're not easy to do, and they don't pass a particularly good signal. It's almost impossible to re-terminate an HDMI head. So no, if one becomes damaged or you install it back to front, because they are directional, if you install them the wrong way around and the walls are closed up, it's a bit of an expensive get out of jail free card, but the only get out of jail free card is to be able to cut both ends off and install fiber extenders either end.
Anonymous, hey, what was the name of those two end-to-end terminations?
Two end-to-end terminators.
What was the name of those end-to-end terminations?
Yeah, are you talking about the INEOS ones?
I don't know, but it came from an anonymous question, so I don't know. We'll try extenders.
Oh, okay. Well, there are several of them. I mean, you can talk more about that than I can, Gary. I mean, since we're on your webinar, I'm going to say AV Pro or INEOS.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for sure. Which is part of the whole group. Everybody's got them. I think AllNet is already on with those SKUs. Maybe MRI is just getting AV Pros underway. So look forward to that, guys. In January, I'm presenting AV Pros with their whole HDMI extension product line. Cleerline always comes up in that discussion, January 6th. That was awesome, guys. Nathan, ST, not sure what that means.
ST. So ST is kind of like a bayonet type, you know, the old bayonet type connector. The STs are a bit like a fiber equivalent of those. They are available. We don't offer them directly as a Cleerline product, but we can offer them to you as a distributed product. You know, we buy them in and we redistribute them to you. The important thing to remember, guys, is our product is compatible with anybody's connectors, as long as you've got that 9-125 or 50-125 spec. All right. So single mode, 9 micron core, 125 micron cladding. Multi-mode, 50-125. As long as the connectors are compatible with that specification, you can use anybody. So if you've got a particular ST connector or LC connector out there that you prefer to use or you need to use, you can use them.
Nathan, the 8K HDMI are one directional. How do you know which way to run them? I've already run 3.
Okay, because we've got source and display written on the ends. You've got source written on one end and display written on the other end.